Imagine being one of the last survivors of your dynasty, hunted across deserts and foreign lands, with nowhere to call home. That was Abd al-Rahman I, an exiled prince who fled for his life, only to return stronger and carve out an emirate of his own. This is the story of how a refugee became the ruler of al-Andalus. I'm David Cott, host of New History of Spain, and in episode 27 we dive into the incredible rise of the first Umayyad Emir of Córdoba. The Epic of Abd al-Rahman ibn Muawiya. After the Abbasid revolution triumphed, the uncle of the first Abbasid caliph organized a massacre that resulted in the killing of many men, women and children from the Umayyad family, the previous caliphal dynasty. However, some managed to survive. One of them was Abd al-Rahman ibn Muawiya, a grandson of Caliph Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik, who was about 20 years old. Chroniclers describe him as tall and thin, blunt and blind in one eye. According to the chronicler Ibn Hayyan, the Umayyad prince was hiding with his 4-year-old son, Suleiman, and a younger brother in a village near the Euphrates River when they suddenly saw commotion outside their tent. It was the black banners of the Abbasids approaching. He hastily grabbed some coins, and his Greek freedman, Badr, found a guide to help them cross the Euphrates. However, the guide turned out to be an Abbasid spy, and within minutes, Abbasid cavalry was chasing them. Abd al-Rahman grabbed his son and swam desperately across the river. His younger brother, exhausted, turned back toward the riverbank, lured by the false promises of the Abbasid soldiers who assured him they will spare his life. But as soon as he reached them, they beheaded him. Abd al-Rahman, along with his son and Badr, had no choice but to keep swimming to the other side of the river. He stayed in Egypt for a few days, but when he learned that Caliph al-Safa had ordered the Egyptian governor to hunt down any hidden Umayyads, he was forced to flee. He moved to a city in Libya, where he kept a low profile until the search died down. Eventually, he made his way to Ifriqiya, modern-day Tunisia, a province ruled by Abd al-Rahman ibn Habib, from the Firid lineage. The exiled prince arrived in Kairouan and found refuge with a family of Moulas, loyal clients of his great-grandfather. At first, the governor of Ifriqiya welcomed Umayyads to challenge the Abbasids and assert his own independence. However, he soon changed his mind when he realized they posed a threat to his own legitimacy. According to an anonymous chronicle, Ibn Habib's soldiers discovered Abd al-Rahman's hiding place. But the Berber wife of the man who had sheltered him hid Abd al-Rahman beneath her skirts. She began to cry when the soldiers barged in, and fearing that her husband would accuse them of dishonoring her, they left. Because of these adventures and his ability to survive countless revolts and conspiracies as the Emir of al-Andalus, Abd al-Rahman earned several nicknames: the Immigrant, the Falcon of al-Andalus, and the Falcon of the Quraysh, a nickname given to him by none other than the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur, according to chroniclers. Later, Abd al-Rahman left the household where he had taken refuge and traveled to his mother's homeland, perhaps his intended destination from the very beginning. His maternal uncles from the Berber Nafza tribal confederation took him near Nekor, in Morocco's Rif region. By this point, Abd al-Rahman had spent 5 years wandering through the Western Islamic world in miserable and uncertain conditions, often coming close to capture or assassination by Abbasid agents or the Firids of Ifriqiya. If he had hoped to establish independent rule in the Maghreb, he failed to secure enough support. And if even his mother's homeland would not back him, where else could he go? That was when he received news from the westernmost part of the Islamic world, al-Andalus, the Iberian Peninsula. Upon learning of the political turmoil there, he saw an opportunity to seize power. His ever-loyal freedman, Badr, crossed the Alboran Sea in 754 and contacted 2 Umayyad chiefs and clients from the junta or military regiment of Damascus, who had settled in the Cura or province of Elvira, modern-day Granada, to gauge their loyalty. These men then informed the leader of the junta of Kinasrin, who was based in the province of Jaén. Eventually, the three agreed to support the Umayyad claimant, though they first wanted to consult with al-Sumail, the strongman of the defeated Emirate of al-Andalus. In episode 26, The Fall of the Umayyad Caliphate, we saw how these Umayyad clients participated in General al-Sumail's relief expedition to Zaragoza and tested his support for the Umayyad cause. However, al-Sumail refused to make any commitments. Some chronicles suggest that at most he agreed to persuade Emir Yusuf al-Firi to welcome Abd al-Rahman and offer him his daughter's hand in marriage. Seeing that things were not moving in his favor, in August 755, Abd al-Rahman landed on the shores of Burriana, in what is now Nerja, Malaga. An army of chiefs and soldiers, most if not all of whom had never even seen the young Umayyad refugee, welcomed him. This was a testament to the power of loyalty and client networks, as well as to the enduring prestige of the Umayyad name. The future emir first stayed with the leaders of the Syrian junts. Meanwhile, Emir Yusuf and General al-Sumail were in the northeast, suppressing a pro-Abbasid revolt, when they received word of Abd al-Rahman's arrival. The foundation of the Emirate of Córdoba. Envoys led by Emir Yusuf al-Firi's secretary met with the Umayyad prince to offer him shelter, his daughter's hand, in marriage, and perhaps even a portion of al-Andalus to govern. However, this luxurious exile did not align with Abd al-Rahman's true political ambitions. The two sides were reportedly close to reaching an agreement until the arrogance of Yusuf's secretary caused the negotiations to fall apart. When the secretary received a letter from the leader of the Junta of Damascus, he scoffed that the general would have to work hard to write such an eloquent reply as his. The Umayyad Mullah could not tolerate the secretary's insolence, so he threw the letter to his face and ordered his men to beat him up. Abd al-Rahman's supporters rejoiced, and one exclaimed, quote, "This is the beginning of our victory, for Yusuf's power rests entirely on this man." End quote. Tellingly, they also insulted the secretary by calling him a wild donkey, a common Arab slur against non-Arabs. This might seem anecdotal, but in reality, while the Abbasid revolution in the east ended the supremacy of ethnic Arabs, the establishment of an independent Umayyad state in al-Andalus ensured that Arab dominance in administration, the military, and society would persist for much longer. According to historian Pierre Richard, the endurance of Arab rule was one of al-Andalus's defining features compared to the rest of the Islamic world. In any case, Prince Abd al-Rahman knew how to exploit al-Andalus's political situation to his advantage. The Firid Emirate was still somewhat fragile due to the exclusion of Yaman Arabs from power and widespread discontent caused by poor harvests and famine. The young Abd al-Rahman launched a propaganda campaign among the Arabs of present-day Andalusia and managed to gather around 3,000 men from Elvira, Sidonia, Seville, and the province of Malaga. The Junta of Jordan, based in Archidona, Malaga, proclaimed the immigrant as their emir. His support base included both Berbers and some Arab groups, both descendants of the original conquerors and Syrian Arab settlers. Most of the Arabs who helped him seize power in al-Andalus belonged to the Yaman faction, who resented their exclusion from Yusuf and al-Sumail's government and sought revenge for the massacre they suffered in the Battle of Sakunda in 747. After taking power, Abd al-Rahman sought support from both Yaman and Qais factions, as well as his own Umayyad clients and clan members. This strategy eventually helped ease and eliminate the Qais-Yaman rivalry over time. The Umayyad clients form a group of about 500 men within the junts of Damascus and Kinasrin. Some were non-Arab freedmen who had been Arabized, while others were Arabs from prominent lineages, such as two grandsons of Mughith al-Rumi, the conqueror of Córdoba. Thanks to their loyalty during the Umayyads' darkest hour, these men founded lineages that would become the core of the Cordoban Umayyad dynasty's support throughout the Emirate of Córdoba, securing most of the key positions in government. The Umayyads of Córdoba legitimized their dynasty by portraying themselves as guardians of Islamic orthodoxy against the Eastern innovations of Baghdad. This emphasis on continuity was also reflected in the very closed Umayyad power circle, where certain families appeared repeatedly over time. Abd al-Rahman reached out to several Berber families for support. Among those who joined him after his landing were the Banu al-Hali and the Banu Ilyas. The Banu Ilyas had arrived with the Berber conqueror Tariq ibn Ziyad and settled in Sidonia, while the Banu al-Hali had been clients of Caliph Yazid II and had established themselves in the mountains around Ronda. The latter could provide him with 400 Berber cavalrymen and an unspecified number of infantry soldiers. As a reward for their support of the Umayyad cause, they were later granted the fortress of Canit, in what is now Cañete la Real in Malaga. Meanwhile, Emir Yusuf al-Fihri launched several attacks against the Umayyad loyalists, but failed to secure a victory, rendering him powerless as Abd al-Rahman marched into Seville and received pledges of allegiance. Seville's warm reception of the Umayyad prince was too much for Yusuf to ignore, and he had no choice but to go all in. A Firid army advanced from Córdoba to Seville, but on the opposite side of the river, the Umayyad troops were also advancing, aiming to take Córdoba by surprise. In a comical twist, both armies suddenly found themselves facing each other on opposite sides of the Guadalquivir River. Yusuf decided to retreat to Córdoba, while the Umayyad forces continued their march toward the capital. However, once again, both armies found themselves on opposite sides of the Guadalquivir, this time right outside Córdoba, in a place known as Al-Musara. In a deceptive and dishonorable move, Abd al-Rahman sent envoys offering peace and food as a sign of surrender, all while secretly preparing a nighttime operation to move his troops across the river. At dawn, the Battle of Al-Musara or Battle of Alameda began. The Umayyad cavalry launched an initial charge that sent part of the Firid army fleeing. Abd al-Rahman had no banner, so he improvised one by tying a green turban to a spear, an emblem that would later become a symbol of the Cordoban Umayyads. Some of his Arab allies feared that Abd al-Rahman might flee on horseback if the battle turned against him, so to reassure them, the immigrant dismounted and switched to a mule, calming his troops. The Umayyad cavalry and infantry charged once more. Yusuf and al-Sumail each lost a son and were forced to flee in defeat. The Umayyads captured valuable spoils, and their Yaman allies celebrated their long-awaited vengeance for their defeat at Secunda in 747. On May 15, 756, Abd al-Rahman ibn Muawiya entered Córdoba, took possession of the governor's palace, and proclaimed himself Emir of al-Andalus, thus founding what became known as the Emirate of Córdoba. Al-Andalus, a rebellious land. The power of Abd al-Rahman I was still very fragile when he took control of Córdoba, and only a long reign of 32 years allowed the Umayyad dynasty to consolidate its rule in Al-Andalus, far from the east, ruled by their enemies, the Abbasids. As emir, he had to create a cohesive emirate, establish his authority over local Arab, Berber, and indigenous leaders, set up a bureaucracy, and built new infrastructure and mosques. He relied on his core group of clients and an army composed of Arabs and Berbers. With this support, the new emir was able to suppress multiple challenges to his authority, all of which ultimately failed due to a lack of coordinated action. Just as Abd al-Rahman I had to fight to consolidate his power, I am also working hard to bring you these fascinating stories. If you enjoy my podcasts and videos, I invite you to join my community on Patreon at patreon.com/newhistoryspain, or support me with a paid Apple Podcast subscription or a one-time donation so I can continue producing high-quality historical content. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel for more content besides this chronological series, and thank you for your support. That said, it's important to highlight that in these revolts, or rather resistance to accepting a new authority, the main figures were always Arabs or Berbers, while there is absolute silence regarding the Christian Hispano-Gothic population, which remained largely passive. During the reign of Abd al-Rahman I, we can distinguish three types of revolts. The first type consisted of rebellions for control of the emirate, primarily led by the former governor Yusuf al-Fihri, his relatives, and his supporters. The second type involved various uprisings and conspiracies aimed at eliminating the Umayyads and expanding Abbasid authority in Al-Andalus. However, after several failed attempts, the caliphs of Baghdad abandoned these aspirations following Abd al-Rahman's death. The third type of revolt, the most common during the entire period of the Emirate of Córdoba, was related to struggles over power distribution or conflicts between local rulers and Córdoba. In other words, the challenges of building a state and imposing centralized political and fiscal control over all of al-Andalus. The most immediate problem the new emir faced was dealing a final blow to Yusuf and al-Sumail. To achieve this, he needed to ensure he had loyal men, as he had noticed discontent among some of his troops after he prevented them from looting Córdoba. Some even spoke of assassinating him, leading him to carry out purges and set out an example of what would happen to traitors. Initially, al-Rahman preferred reconciliation over force in dealing with Yusuf's supporters to heal the divide between the Qais and Yaman Arab factions. But Yusuf and al-Sumail did not stand idly by. Yusuf traveled to Toledo to raise an army, while al-Sumail went to Jaén to recruit men from the Kinarrin army who had not joined the Umayyads. When Abd al-Rahman learned that Yusuf and al-Sumail's troops had joined forces, he set out to confront them, leaving behind a small garrison in Córdoba. The Firids launched a surprise attack on Córdoba, and for a brief moment, one of Yusuf's sons took the capital. However, upon hearing that the Umayyad emir was returning, he quickly evacuated. Yusuf and al-Sumail then retreated to the Vega of Granada County, where, seeing their prospects worsening, they requested a pardon from the emir in exchange for keeping their properties. The emir agreed, demanding that two of Yusuf's sons be handed over as hostages. al-Rahman then returned to Córdoba, accompanied by Yusuf and al-Sumail, believing that no one would challenge his rule in al-Andalus anymore. However, Abd al-Rahman was naive to think that the Firids would abandon their ambitions so easily. In 759, Yusuf al-Firi escaped from Córdoba and fled to Mérida, where he had many Berber clients who encouraged him to rebel alongside others from Toledo. However, the governors of Seville and Morón defeated the Firid army. Afterward, Yusuf wandered toward Toledo, until his few remaining supporters betrayed him and sent his severed head to Córdoba. Meanwhile, al-Sumail, upon Yusuf's escape, was immediately imprisoned and strangled a few months later on the emir's orders. This betrayal of the amnesty granted to Yusuf forever changed the first Umayyad emir's conciliatory attitude. He became more decisive and ruthless against any challenge to his authority. He literally cut off the heads of many rebels. The sons of Yusuf and other members of the Firid lineage continued attempting to overthrow the Umayyads, always counting on the loyalty of Berbers from the central and eastern regions of Iberia. When Córdoba fell under Umayyad control, Toledo was still ruled by a cousin of Yusuf who refused to recognize Umayyad authority until the emir himself besieged the city and reached an agreement in 761. This cousin rebelled again the following year, which led to the execution of his son, who had been sent to Córdoba as a hostage to ensure his obedience. Finally, in 764, an army led by the Mullah Badr marched on Toledo, where a faction of Arabs betrayed the governor and handed over the Firid loyalists to be crucified in the capital. The last Firid uprising was led by Yusuf's only surviving son, who launched a rebellion in Toledo in 785 with support from the Nafza Berber tribe, the same tribe as the emir's mother. Abd al-Rahman I personally marched against Toledo, and the Umayyad army had little trouble annihilating most of the rebel forces, resulting in the death of Yusuf's son. Suleiman, the emir's eldest son, was then given the honor of governing the former Visigothic royal seat to ensure no further uprisings. In 763, Abd al-Rahman faced the first Abbasid attempt to overthrow him. The rebellion broke out among the Syrian junta stationed in Beja, Portugal, and was led by an Arab named al-Ala ibn Mughith. Ibn Mughith had significant financial backing and the legitimacy of Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur's support, making it easy to gain followers in his mission to overthrow an independent emirate whose long-term survival was uncertain. This was a serious threat, and the Emir of Córdoba had only a small force of unquestionably loyal soldiers. His army was likely smaller than the Abbasid rebel force, so instead of staying in Córdoba, he moved to the fortress of Carmona in Seville, renowned for its impregnable defenses. For 2 months, the Umayyad ruler was under siege in Carmona, with no reinforcements arriving to break the blockade. Imagine for a moment how desperate the situation was. An emir under siege with dwindling water and food supplies, morale plummeting, and his leadership being questioned. Faced with this crisis, Abd al-Rahman took a bold risk. He gathered his 700 most loyal men and launched an all-or-nothing counterattack by opening the fortress's main gate. Before doing so, he built a fire and burned his soldiers' scabbards, proclaiming, quote, "Go forth with me against this multitude, never to return." End quote. The Umayyad fortresses caught the Abbasid troops by surprise and defeated them, killing al-Ala ibn Mughith and other rebel leaders. A merchant later took the severed heads of the rebel leaders to Kairouan, displaying them in the market as a warning to anyone who dared to challenge the Umayyad ruler. According to Andalusi chronicles, Caliph al-Mansur of Baghdad thanked God for the sea that separated him from Abd al-Rahman, openly admiring the immigrant's ability to overcome even the most dire circumstances. Meanwhile, some Yaman Arabs that had helped Abd al-Rahman seize power in Córdoba became disillusioned when their expectations of hegemonic power were not met. In 764, the dismissed governor of Algeciras rebelled in Seville. The emir's forces besieged the city and its inhabitants surrendered the rebel leader in exchange for a pardon. In 766, another Yaman Arab revolt broke out in Niebla, Huelva. Some sources claim this was another pro-Abbasid uprising, but that doesn't seem to be the case. The Yaman seized Seville and the fortress of Alcalá de Guadaira, but the emir besieged the fortress until the rebel leader confronted him in battle. However, unlike Abd al-Rahman's bold maneuver at Carmona, this rebel leader failed. He was beheaded and his forces surrendered. That same year, the governor of Seville, a Yaman Arab who had supported the Umayyad takeover, was dismissed. In response, he sent letters to other Arab leaders to organize an uprising. Unfortunately for him, some of his intended allies forwarded these letters to the emir. Summoned to Córdoba, he was executed. In 772, yet another rebellion broke out among the Syrian junta from Emesa, a station in Seville and Niebla. The emir marched with his second son, Hisham, to crush the revolt. Loyal Berbers in Abd al-Rahman's camp sent letters to their counterparts among the rebels, urging them to desert during the battle. And they did, causing the rebels to scatter and suffer a massacre. There were multiple conspiracies involving dismissed governors or those who felt insufficiently rewarded for their service. But none gained traction, and all ended with the exile or execution of the plotters. Even Badr, Abd al-Rahman's once loyal freedman, became insolent toward his boss and was punished with the confiscation of his assets and exile. However, after a few years, the emir deemed that Badr had served his penance and allowed him to return. In the Meseta Central or Central Plateau, a Berber religious agitator emerged, claiming to be a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad and rallying widespread support among the Berbers. This self-proclaimed messiah mounted a serious and prolonged resistance between 768 and 777, using the mountains to his advantage against the emir's forces. His movement also led to the assassination of provincial governors in heavily Berber-colonized regions such as Mérida and Santander, modern-day Cuenca and Guadalajara. The rebels controlled a vast area between the Tagus and Guadiana rivers, forcing the emir to reinforce Córdoba's walls. However, the agitator was ultimately assassinated by some of his own followers, who were bribed by the emir. It is evident that the Berbers did not easily accept Orthodox Sunni Islam and frequently led Kharahite uprisings, or in this case a mix of Kharahite and Shia rebellions, reflecting their tendency to embrace Islam on their own terms while rejecting any doctrine that hinted at Arab supremacism. Many revolts also broke out in distant provinces such as Zaragoza and Barcelona. It is important to understand that any local governor who refused to acknowledge Umayyad authority and did not send tribute to Córdoba was considered a rebel, even if they had never formally accepted Abd al-Rahman I's rule in the first place. It is understandable why they resisted. Many local rulers had been governing independently for years. Why should they submit to a higher authority and send taxes to another city without receiving anything in return? The conflict between local powers and Córdoba persisted throughout the Emirate of Córdoba. Since most provincial tax revenues remained where they were collected, local governors could fund their own armies or even wage jihad against Christian lands without Córdoba's involvement. Even in 776 or 777, ships arrived from Ifriqiya carrying Abbasid soldiers, led by Yusuf al-Firis's son-in-law, known as al-Siklabi, the Slav, due to his blonde hair and blue eyes. The Abbasid Caliph sent him to overthrow the Umayyads. Upon his arrival, al-Siklabi gained the support of the governor of Zaragoza, or according to other sources, the governor of Barcelona. But this support was soon withdrawn when it became clear that al-Siklabi struggled to recruit a large army, as the Falcon of the Quraysh had by then consolidated his authority far more than in previous years. Al-Siklabi marched against Zaragoza or Barcelona without success, while the emir burned his ships in Tutmir, roughly modern-day Murcia, leaving al-Siklabi stranded in the eastern regions. Eventually, Abd al-Rahman I placed a bounty on his head, and a Berber assassinated him. This was the last Abbasid attempt to overthrow the Umayyads in al-Andalus. Internally, it may also have marked the end of the validity of the Treaty of Tutmir, which had respected the authority of a Visigothic magnate since the Muslim conquest. Just a few years later, the second Emir of Córdoba, Hisham, appointed a governor for the province. Foreign policy of Abd al-Rahman I. Due to the civil war in al-Andalus after 740, as discussed in episode 23, the Governorate of al-Andalus, Arab rule over Septimania weakened significantly, culminating in the fall of Narbonne to the Franks in the 750s. The Emirate of Córdoba lacked the vast military apparatus of the Umayyad Caliphate of Damascus, which shaped its foreign policy. The Umayyad emirs of Córdoba already had enough internal problems to concern themselves with the Christian polities that were emerging and expanding. To avoid anachronisms, from an Islamic perspective, especially in the 8th century, there was no recognized Christian kingdom in the Iberian Peninsula because the Muslims had conquered the entire region and demanded tributes from all of its inhabitants. This included the north, where capitulation agreements had been common. Hence, the continuous military raids against Christians during the Emirial period were the only means to force de facto independent Christian powers to occasionally pay the tributes they owed to Córdoba from an Islamic perspective. Abd al-Rahman I struggled to establish his authority in regions with a strong Arab and Berber presence, which meant he could barely pay attention to the Kingdom of Asturias. There seems to have been an expedition during the reign of Fruela. According to Asturian chronicles, Alfonso I's son won victories in Galicia and even executed the governor of Moron, a cousin of the emir. In another campaign, the emir's army, led by Badr, obtained tributes and hostages from the Basque province of Álava, which at the time was under Asturian control. Between 768 and 788, there is no record of conflicts between Asturians and Cordobans, partly because the Berber rebellion in central Iberia acted as a buffer, preventing further attacks on the Cantabrian mountains. In 781 and 782, the Maula Badr campaigned in Vasconia and La Rioja to subdue their populations, collect the jizya or poll tax on Christians, and take hostages. Arabic sources begin to mention regional Vasconic leaders who had existed since the Visigothic period but had previously remained anonymous, such as Galindo Velasco Tenes, father of García Galíndez de Abad, the future Count of Aragon. He submitted the Sobrarbe district of northern Aragon to nominal Umayyad rule by handing over hostages and tribute. However, the rise of the Kingdom of Asturias and other autonomous local powers in the Pyrenees and the Douro Basin was not a major concern for the Emirate of Córdoba. In terms of foreign policy, the biggest threats were the Abbasid Caliphate and the expansionism of the Carolingian Empire, which also affected Andalusi territories. The Arab governors of Barcelona, Girona, Huesca, and Zaragoza did not recognize Umayyad authority. In 777, they reached out to Charlemagne, inviting him to march into the Iberian Peninsula. The Frankish army passed through Pamplona and reached Zaragoza, only to find the city gates closed. They briefly besieged the city, but news of a rebellion in Saxony discouraged Charlemagne from continuing the campaign. Things took a turn for the worse during the retreat, when a group of Vascons ambushed the rearguard of the Frankish army in the Battle of Roncesvalles Pass, a topic we will explore in detail in another episode. The first known diplomatic contact between Charlemagne and the Cordoban ruler involved negotiations for the release of one of Emir's generals who had been taken prisoner by Charlemagne's Muslim allies. Later records indicate that peace was agreed upon between both powers. It was only in 781 that Abd al-Rahman I secured recognition of his authority over the most important city in the Upper March, Zaragoza. However, Umayyad control over the provinces farthest from Córdoba was always fragile. So much so that within a few months, Cordoban troops had to return to Zaragoza to besiege it with catapults. This time, the emir tortured the rebel leader before executing him, though he kept his promise to be lenient with the man's family. Abd al-Rahman I was unable to prevent the Carolingian conquest of Girona and Urgell in 785. Due to their distance from the Andalusi capital and the lack of Arab and Berber settlers in those regions, the Muslim garrisons were insufficient to maintain control over these areas, which fell out of the Islamic sphere. Domestic policy of Abd al-Rahman I. Abd al-Rahman I did not assume the title of caliph because at that time it implied a claim to govern the entire Muslim community, both secularly and religiously, which did not seem realistic. However, he did claim political independence from the Abbasids in several ways. After 1 year in power, he ordered that Friday sermons in mosques be delivered in his name and that the Abbasids be cursed. In 763, the emir resumed minting coins after a halt in al-Andalus since 749, perhaps not coincidentally after defeating the first Abbasid attempt to overthrow him. However, throughout the Emirate of Córdoba, only silver dirhams were minted, as minting gold coins was a prerogative of the caliph, and access to gold from sub-Saharan Africa was still limited. To consolidate his authority, he confiscated almost all the lands of Ardabast, the son of Visigothic king Witiza, who had been an influential figure during the governorate of al-Andalus. Abd al-Rahman I would not tolerate anyone rivaling him in terms of wealth within his emirate. This was also a necessary step in establishing an Islamic emirate and eliminating the influence of the Christian Hispano-Gothic elite. Moreover, the Falcon of al-Andalus formed a personal guard composed of slaves in response to repeated uprisings by various factions of Andalusi society. This created new bonds of loyalty with the slaves who were more faithful and dependent than the Syrian Juns or the Moulas, who had helped him seize power and already held high socioeconomic status. Even so, this force appears to have been limited to a small palace guard, which would later expand under Emir al-Hakam I. From the reign of Abd al-Rahman I, we begin to see the provincial division of al-Andalus into curas, each managed by a governor appointed by the emir. However, the 8th century is poorly documented regarding biographies of significant figures of the time. The emir also built the Umayyad Alcázar, or castle, in Córdoba, replacing the previous palace of the governors of al-Andalus, which had been a repurposed Visigothic-era building. Today, little remains of the residential and administrative complex of the Umayyad Alcázar of Córdoba, but it was located right next to the Great Mosque, reflecting the era's concept of power where politics and religion were inseparable. Whoever controlled the Alcázar of Córdoba held sovereignty over al-Andalus, and the Alcázar remained a symbol of legitimacy even after the construction of the Palatine city of Madinat al-Zahra in the 10th century. The Falcon of al-Andalus also built a rural residence on the northern outskirts of Córdoba, complete with gardens and orchards, modeled after the residence of al-Rusafa that his grandfather had built in Syria. He and other Umayyad exiles longed for their homeland, a sentiment the emir himself captured in a poem full of nostalgia. Quote, "A palm tree stands in the middle of Rusafa, born in the west, far from the land of palms. I said to it, 'How like me you are, far away and in exile. In long separation from family and friends, you have sprung from soil in which you are a stranger, and I, like you, am far from home.'" End quote. From this al-Rusafa, located at the foot of the Sierra Morena in the northwest of Córdoba, a district later emerged that became famous as a residential area for the Cordoban elite. The Umayyad family in al-Andalus. Regarding the Umayyad family that migrated to al-Andalus, at least 400 direct descendants of al-Rahman I are known until the fall of the Caliphate of Córdoba, though they had many more descendants who remain unidentified. The first Cordoban emir had 11 sons and 9 daughters, thanks to the demographic potential provided by polygamy and concubinage. al-Rahman I envisioned a dynasty supported by an extensive family, which is why he not only relied on his own descendants, but also welcomed more surviving members of the Umayyad dynasty who had remained in hiding and gradually made their way to the distant al-Andalus after the Emirate of Córdoba was established. More distant relatives from the Marwanid branch of the dynasty were also well received in al-Andalus. One example is Abd al-Malik ibn Umar, grandson of Caliph Marwan I, who was appointed governor of Seville in 757. The new emir entrusted this distant relative with controlling the Junta of Emesa, stationed in Seville, though its leaders rebelled numerous times. Abd al-Malik ibn Umar helped suppress these uprisings, and in reward for his loyalty, he married his daughter to the emir's successor, Hisham. The Marwanid descendants were then able to serve as governors and generals. Al-Andalus became the perfect refuge for a dynasty that had been overthrown in the east. The Umayyad family was highly hierarchical, and not all members were treated equally. The emir's children and wives held a higher status than his siblings, cousins, and more distant relatives. Those without close ties to the ruling emir had to accept their political irrelevance and submission, which was compensated with grants of income, properties, and slaves. More distant relatives were buried in a separate cemetery, whereas emirs and caliphs were interred in the Cordoban Alcázar. Regarding the succession of the Umayyads in Córdoba, primogeniture appears to have been the most common principle, though the emir could also personally designate his heir based on preference, family consensus, or the candidate's qualities. This strict hierarchy and the acceptance of hereditary succession prevented an excess of claimants from emerging within the extensive Umayyad family tree. That said, it is true that the first emirs of Córdoba did face some challenges from close relatives attempting to seize the throne. Abd al-Rahman I himself uncovered a conspiracy by his nephew in 783 and had him executed. 2 years later, another nephew conspired alongside the son of General al-Sumail, but their plot was exposed and they too were executed. To prevent dynastic conflicts, some sons, brothers, or uncles of the emirs were given important administrative or military positions, while more distant relatives were rarely granted such roles. The key point to understand is that while the Umayyad family was extensive, the circle of power was small, and it only became smaller with the establishment of the Caliphate of Córdoba. The construction of the Great Mosque of Córdoba. Arabic chronicles reference some of the earliest mosques built in al-Andalus, such as those in Cartella, Algeciras, Zaragoza, Seville, and Córdoba. Unfortunately, the remains of these first Andalusi mosques have not been preserved, and the little we know suggests that they were small in size because there were still relatively few Muslims. The sources that mention these early mosques do not refer to churches being converted to mosques, meaning that the practice of repurposing existing buildings, common later when many mosques were turned into churches, did not occur in this case. With the Muslim conquest, some churches were destroyed or looted, but most remained in use, and new Christian places of worship were allowed to be built outside city walls. The idea that churches were destroyed en masse in the early years of Arab rule is a literary myth that emerged centuries after the conquest. However, it is true that in some cases, Christian and Muslim places of worship shared a space or were located side by side. Ultimately, the conversion, destruction, or abandonment of churches and monasteries was a gradual process that followed the increasing Islamization of the local population. But generally, new mosques were built from scratch rather than replacing existing buildings. I have already mentioned the construction of the Umayyad Alcázar and Al-Rusafa, but if there is one architectural achievement for which Abd al-Rahman I is best known, it is undoubtedly the Great Mosque of Córdoba. Construction began in 785 on the foundations of the mosque that had been built during the era of the provincial governors. A widely accepted but questionable story claims that Abd al-Rahman I negotiated with the Christian community to demolish the Church of St. Vincent, purchasing their half of the land for a large sum of money and granting them permission to build churches outside the city. However, this story was likely invented to glorify the first Umayyad emirs' magnanimity and religious tolerance, or perhaps to create a parallel to the similarly legendary story of the construction of the Umayyad Mosque of Damascus. Archaeological investigations in the 1930s and 1990s did not yield definitive evidence to resolve the debate over whether a Christian church once stood on the site. In 2021, new excavations uncovered the remains of a large 5th century building complex. Some argue that this site may have been a monastery or an episcopal complex with religious and residential structures. Others, however, point to the lack of a clearly identifiable Christian temple, the absence of liturgical furnishing, and the lack of burials as a strong evidence that there were no Christian buildings there, only a residential complex from the Visigothic period. The debate is heated because it has important legal, political, and economic implications, as proving that a church once existed on the site supports the argument that the Mosque Cathedral of Córdoba should belong to the Catholic Church rather than being public property. In any case, further archaeological research is needed to draw firmer conclusions. The original Great Mosque of Córdoba covered about 2,700 square meters or 29,000 square feet, with 11 naves and a capacity for approximately 5,000 worshippers. As was common in early mosques, the Great Mosque of Córdoba was connected to a large courtyard, which served for ritual washing before prayer and as a social space. Near the entrance to the prayer hall, the Qadi, or judge, of Córdoba will also hold court, resolving civil and criminal disputes. Over time, the mosque underwent significant modifications through the expansions of Abd al-Rahman II, al-Hakam II, al-Mansur, and even Charles V, who ultimately altered much of the original Islamic design. For the Umayyad rulers, expanding and embellishing the Great Mosque of Córdoba was a crucial part of their legacy, which is why they continuously enlarged it until it covered 5 times its original surface area. The construction of the Mosque of Córdoba involved the reuse of numerous Roman and Visigothic columns, and is especially known for its horseshoe-shaped arches, which were also characteristic of Visigothic architecture. Art historians have long debated the extent to which the mosque was influenced by Eastern Islamic styles versus local Hispano-Gothic traditions. Regardless of these influences, the mosque introduced architectural features and functions that had no precedent in the Iberian Peninsula. Instead of using pillars, the mosque's design incorporated superimposed arches to create an open and unified space, reinforcing the idea of equality among Muslims. The alternating use of stone and brick in the arches created a striking red and white pattern which became a hallmark of Umayyad architecture in later buildings. One particularly curious aspect of the mosque's construction arose during the reign of Caliph al-Hakam II. When he set out to build a new mihrab, the niche indicating the direction of prayer toward Mecca, Andalusia scholars realized that the entire structure had been improperly oriented, facing south instead of toward Mecca. This sparked considerable debate. However, this misalignment was not unique to Córdoba. Many other mosques in al-Andalus, North Africa, and even Mecca itself were originally oriented according to the sun, before the practice of precisely aligning mosques toward the Kaaba in Mecca became standardized. The Umayyads could have corrected the layout or preserved it as it was, and they chose the latter. The dynasty was deeply conservative, always seeking to follow the example of their revered ancestors. This conservatism extended to both religious matters, in which they avoided any theological innovation that might corrupt Prophet Muhammad's teachings, and to dynastic practices, in which they upheld the original design of Abd al-Rahman I as a matter of political legitimacy.
The verdict.
In today's verdict, I want to highlight the political acumen of Abd al-Rahman I of Córdoba. There is no doubt that this refugee, who wandered for years across the Western Islamic world, could not have achieved what he did without the prestige of his lineage. However, if he had been incompetent, he never would have succeeded in establishing an independent and enduring emirate. He skillfully secured the support of the Yemen Arabs, who resented the administration of Yusuf and al-Sumail, but later gradually reduced their influence to prevent the continued infighting between Qais and Yaman factions that had weakened the Umayyad Caliphate of Damascus. In doing so, he created a new dominant faction, the Umayyad faction, that will sustain the Emirate of Córdoba. Abd al-Rahman had no qualms about deceiving Yusuf by pretending to surrender, nor did he hesitate to execute former allies or even members of his own family, all to ensure his survival and that of his lineage in the farthest reaches of the Islamic world. If an Andalusi Machiavelli had existed, he surely would not have pointed to Ferdinand the Catholic as the prime example of a pragmatic and astute ruler, but rather to the ultimate survivor, Abd al-Rahman ibn Muawiya. People often remember Abd al-Rahman III for declaring himself caliph and crushing all the rebels who had stopped recognizing Umayyad authority. However, in comparison, I believe that Abd al-Rahman I's achievements were even more impressive, as he had to build almost from scratch the foundations for the Umayyad dynasty's rule in Córdoba. This is the story of survival and power struggles of Abd al-Rahman I's reign. And with that, the verdict ends. Before you go, remember that you can join my Patreon community at patreon.com/newhistoryspain to get early access to all my content, appear in the credits, or receive exclusive merchandise. Follow New History of Spain on social media, and if you are watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss anything. In the next episode, I will be talking about the history of the Kingdom of Asturias during the second half of the 8th century. Thanks for listening, and see you next time!